second step in the research cycle is reviewing existing research. Now, this can be frustrating because you just want to get on with it. You know what you want to study, you know what your focus is going to be, you just want to get on with it. So why? What could possibly be a good reason to review what other people have done? There's actually several. And I'm going to use the example I offered previously of whether or not the amount of interaction between different families in hospital waiting rooms affects perceived optimism or pessimism regarding the healthcare of their ill family member. The textbook points out when you take the time to look at what other people have done before you, it does serve several practical purposes. And this may sound a bit funny, this may sound a bit odd, but when you start reviewing existing literature, meaning research that has already been done in this area, you may discover that somebody else has already put in the time and effort into researching the exact same question you are currently interested in. So using the example of the families of patients talking with each other in a waiting room, maybe that's already been studied. And more than that, maybe the study was just published last year in some academic health journal. Imagine how horrible it would be, how heartbreaking it would be to discover this fact 8 months down the road after you've already completed all the prep work and you're just about to begin the actual study. So, it's important to review existing research, existing literature, to make sure you're not replicating what's already been done. You're not repeating it when it is research that does not need to be repeated. Now, having said that, having pointed out that you don't want to unnecessarily replicate research, wasting your time and efforts and probably your financial resources, at the same time, sometimes researchers will do that on purpose. They want to see if research can be replicated for a few reasons. They might attempt to replicate research because they simply cannot believe or accept the results that the previous researcher provided. Maybe there's a belief that the original researcher was biased in some way, and that affected the results. Maybe there's a belief that the original researcher was hoping to be able to come to a specific conclusion, and as a result of this hope affected the manner in which they conducted their research, that it was biased. Maybe you have such a hard time believing the results that you think there's got to be another factor in there that hasn't been reported in the results. There's got to be something in there affecting them. So you try to replicate the exact same research in the exact same way to prove it can't be replicated. And that would indicate that there must have been something else going on that affected the results. Or maybe you want to attempt to replicate previous research to prove it is valid, to prove that there is, in fact, no other issue, no other factor that led to the original results except what the original researcher said. And this does happen, whether it's in social sciences like sociology or psychology, or in regards to the physical sciences. But that means that you, the new researcher, you have an awareness of this, and you are conducting your research with the goal or the purpose of investigating whether the original results can in fact be replicated. It's almost like you have two goals in your research: to investigate the original research question and to see if previous results could be replicated, thus proving the original results were valid, or proving the original results were somehow not valid, not true. And in addition, if you review previous research, you might discover, if you reviewed previous research about your research question and discovered something similar, that doesn't mean you can't continue. In fact, it might actually help refine your research question, making it more focused and more specific. So I have an example here on the screen. If you discovered previous research regarding something very similar about interaction between the families of patients in waiting rooms, was investigated 15 years ago, or even 7 years ago, or even last year. Maybe it focused on a specific ethnic group, or it focused only on emergency rooms, or it focused only on parents of ill children, or it focused only on the families of elderly patients. So you review the research, you see what's already been done in this general area. This might help you refine your research question to better define it. It might get you to think about how you could direct your own research into a specific area. So, you start out with this question generally focusing on the families of patients in waiting rooms. That's the first box on the left. But after reviewing previous literature, you decide to refine your question to focus specifically on families of patients who have been admitted to the hospital. And that's very different than just families who are in the waiting room. And then you decide to further refine your question to focus on patients under the age of 18. And then you decide to further refine your question to focus on the families of patients under age 18 with chronic conditions. So reviewing previous research really can help you identify an area where more research is needed. You find out there's a lot of information about interaction of families of elderly parents, but very little or none about the interaction of families with underage patients with chronic conditions, implying they are in hospitals much more often compared to the general population. So even though sometimes reviewing previous literature feels tedious, you just want to get on with what you want to do, it is extremely useful and valuable and can really help you with your own work and help you potentially produce better results that are more valuable. And learn from other people's mistakes, maybe in regards to the research question itself, or how it was phrased, or how it was presented to research participants. Maybe regarding the research method chosen. Previous researchers chose a survey method with closed-ended questions, which we'll talk about in a second. But by the time their research was completed, they realized open-ended questions would have provided much more detail, a much more detailed analysis of the topic. Using the example of patient families, maybe previous researchers relied mainly on open-ended questions, which allowed respondents to go into a lot of detail. But as a result of that, with the amount of space provided for them to answer, many of the patients' families were stumped. They didn't quite know what to say. They needed assistance getting them to get their thoughts flowing. Or maybe there was so much detail in the answers that when it came time for analysis, which is a further step in the research cycle, it was really, really difficult to come to conclusions and compare answers. Maybe, again, using this example of patient families, the manner in which previous researchers approached families was not productive, so that few families wanted to participate. So that if you take the time to review previous research, you can be critical and analyze what they did from start to finish. How they phrased their question, the method of research they chose, how big their sample size was, how they found potential participants or respondents, how the research itself was conducted, how they handled or processed the results. Essentially, you can pick and pick and pick and pick. And you have the benefit of hindsight. Hindsight is 20/20. And it's great to be able to make use of what somebody else has already done for your own benefit, so you learn from their mistakes. All of this is really, really valuable for somebody considering doing research of any kind, in any discipline, not just sociology, which is why it's also important to take your time and not rush through it. So, you select a research question, and then you review existing literature, and then you've got to decide how you're going to do it. You select a research method. Third step in the research process, one that requires a great deal of investigation and thought itself, careful thought in which you have to consider a whole realm of things, Actual research methods are discussed in detail in this chapter in the textbook, looking at the benefits of each, looking at the weaknesses of each, in what kind of situation each method is most useful and effective, and for what kinds of research questions each research method is best suited. So, research methods, we have experiments, surveys, field research, and existing documents and statistics. Those are the four main research methods that sociology involves, and I'm going to look at each one of them here. And like I said, you have a whole list of things to take into account when you're choosing a research method. And unfortunately, this means much more than which research method would best suit the question. Of course, you have to consider that. But then, as with most things in the world, you've got a budget. These days, you need to take into consideration what your budget is. People who do not conduct research usually don't consider the fact that doing so costs money. Sometimes a lot of money. So this will necessarily have to be taken into account when you choose a research method. If you're conducting a survey by phone or in person, you'll need to hire people to help with that. You'll need to hire people to run it, to assist in collecting data and in analyzing the data. And in addition to a budget, you've got to think of time. Time will factor in the amount of time you have to prepare to get the research done, to get it done, to analyze the data, to prepare the results. You might have a deadline for a company that has hired you, or a deadline to get your thesis completed, or you'll have to pay tuition for another semester. Maybe access to potential respondents or participants will have an effect. You would like to do participant observation, but because of budget and time constraints and a lack of access to your target population, you just can't do it. Or maybe it's difficulty gaining access to subjects. You want to study a particular subculture, such as people who regularly make use of methadone clinics, and you know it's going to take time to earn their trust, so that will affect cost and choice of research method. So, selecting a research method, the first one we're looking at is experiments. To me, when you talk about research, this is the first thing most people automatically picture in their head, an experiment. Even if they don't really understand how an experiment works, when it involves people and not test tubes in a lab. What is an experiment? A highly controlled artificial situation. You are creating the situation for which the research will be done. Experiments can be extremely complicated, or they can actually be relatively simple. And it might seem odd to think of an experiment involving people instead of in a lab with science equipment all around you, but they occur all the time. Maybe the researcher purposely creates an artificial situation to observe how the respondents react to something. For example, in Stockholm, Sweden, an experiment was conducted in a subway station. And what they did was they wanted to see if people's behavior regarding everyday activities could be altered by making them more fun. And this picture looks pretty neat, doesn't it? So what this experiment did was they painted the steps beside an escalator to resemble the keys of a piano. Would this encourage people to take the stairs more, to choose the healthier option? Would this everyday activity suddenly become more fun, and so people are going to be more physically active? On the day this experiment was conducted, 66% more people took the stairs than usual. I've already referred to the Milgram experiment. This was conducted at Yale University, and like I said, they were investigating how we as human beings are trained to take directions from authority figures. So I already used this as an example of unethical and immoral research. What happened was Stanley Milgram measured the willingness to obey authority figures by instructing people in one room to play the role of a teacher and administer electric shocks to a learner or a student in another room if they answered incorrectly. So, you've got the fake test subject wearing a green sweater on the left, and then you've got the subject at the bottom there, and you've got the authority figure behind him. So what would happen was the fake test subject would be answered questions. And if they answered correctly, everything was fine. But if they answered negatively, the subject who was being studied is supposed to push a button, and that button, they were told, would give the fake test subject a shock for every incorrect answer. Now, you see there's a series of buttons. The authority figure behind him would encourage him to increase the level of the shock as the number of incorrect answers added up. Now, the fake test subject was not actually being shocked. But what he would do was, when he was given this fake shock, he would make a noise. And as the intensity of the shocks increased, the amount of noise indicating pain would increase as well. So this subject at the bottom, would he continue to shock, to at least think he was shocking this person, causing him pain, just because an authority figure told him to do so? And actually, subjects did continue to do it. So, Milgram would play recordings to make it sound like the learner was in a great deal of pain and wanted to end the experiment. And even thinking they were listening to somebody in another room in pain because of the shocks they were giving them, many participants continued the experiment when the authority figure urged them to do so, and even increased the voltage, or they thought they were increasing the voltage, after each wrong answer, until some of them eventually administered what would have been lethal shocks. So these are pictures of the actual Milgram experiment. The guy in the white there smoking, he's one of the people who had to administer the shocks. The bystander effect, or bystander apathy, is another area of research related to sociology, where experiments have been conducted, that focuses on the theory that people are actually less likely to help a victim of crime when other people are present. If it's just them, they're more likely to assist. But the more bystanders there are, the less likely people are to offer assistance to the victim. The bystander effect theory, the bystander effect idea, unfortunately evolved from a real-life situation, not an experiment, and in which a woman named Kitty Genovese was murdered in New York. She was stabbed to death just outside her apartment, and a few weeks later, the New York Times published a story, this was in 1964, about the death, claiming that up to 38 people had witnessed the attack but did not do anything to help her. The accuracy of that has been questioned, how many people. But what this story did was spark interest in the likelihood of people to provide assistance to somebody and under what circumstances. And as a result, this has been studied in various ways since then. If you search online, you'll find lots and lots of examples of people simply ignoring somebody in need when part of a crowd, following the norm set by the crowd. So you might think that if a person ever suddenly takes ill, if they have a heart attack or something, if they're being robbed or assaulted, that in a busy urban area, they are much more likely to receive assistance from the people around them. But that's not necessarily true. That's the bystander effect. So this is a picture today of the neighborhood in which she was assaulted and killed. Another experiment that's very well known, that I discuss with my students in several classes, that has been done with people, is the Asch experiments, conducted in 1951 by Solomon Asch. And this is a great example of an artificial situation that is simple. It's almost painfully simple. what he did was he took 8 college students. That's all them little cartoon characters of them sitting at a table. And he placed them all in the same room together, and he would show them cards with lines on them that were labeled. And he would ask very simple questions. Which line is the longest? Which line is the shortest? He would ask them to look at the cards with the lines on it and state which line matched the line on another card. Seems pretty simple and straightforward. But in each group of 8 people, only one of the people was actually being studied. The other 7 were in on the experiment. And what they did was, when this would first start, they would all give the right answer, the obviously correct answer. And the one person who was not in on it, it was always arranged they would answer last. Then, the 7 people before them began purposely giving the incorrect answer. They would all give the same incorrect answer. And this is what Dr. Ash was studying. Would this one person also give an obviously incorrect answer to a very simple question in order to fit in with the group, in order to conform? Or would they still be an individual and go against the grain of the group? So what Dr. Ash was studying was group pressure to conform. And actually, most of the time, believe it or not, people would provide the wrong answer, knowing they were wrong, because on some level they felt pressure to conform to the group. So these are all examples of experiments with people that might be conducted from a sociological perspective. Remember, an experiment is the first kind of research method that we're looking at. Now, when an experiment is conducted, it is extremely important to make use of a process called randomization. And all this means that if somebody is going to participate in an experiment, that they will have an equal chance of being in the control group or the experiment group, which I will explain in a second. Why is it important in what manner a person is assigned to each group? Because a researcher does not want to unconsciously bias their results. They don't want to do something that will give them false results without meaning to. They want true or real results for what they're studying. So if the process used to assign each participant to either the control group or the experimental group is truly random, so that each person has an equal chance of being placed in either group, then the researcher knows whatever result their experiment arrives at is because of what is really going on, not because of some other factor. So, what do I mean by experimental group and control group? The control group is like the baseline for the study. Nothing is going to happen to them. And you know, I remember being in school and I always got these two groups mixed up if I didn't have the definition in front of me. So the control group will be subject to the dependent variable. It provides the baseline for the study. So for me, just, I don't know, maybe a little trick to try to keep them straight. What is the control group? They're controlled, they're dependent, nothing's happening to them. On the other hand, the experimental group is the group that is exposed. So the experimental group is the group that's kind of subject to the experiment. Something is being done to them. They're exposed to what the researchers have predicted will affect something. So I think in the textbook they give you an example of kids watching TV. And if children watch a little bit of violent TV before they play with each other, how does that affect their play and how they play with their toys? So let's say they're shown an hour of TV with violence in it before being placed in the same playroom with the same toys, and they are observed. And then they're rated on a scale of 1 to 10 for how aggressive their play is. So you have a control group and an experimental group. The control group is controlled. They're not shown the hour of violent television. The experimental group is the subject of the experiment. They are exposed to the hour of violent television. And experiments can be very, very valuable in the social sciences. And regarding sociology specifically, because they provide a structure for researchers to potentially identify a single cause of something. And also, it provides them this structure to measure that cause with a high degree of reliability. What am I talking about when I say reliability? I'm talking about the degree to which a measurement procedure yields consistent results. So if other researchers were to perform the exact same experiment a second time, if they were going to try to replicate it under the exact same conditions, would it generate the same results? If it does, that means the data is reliable. And what that is going to do then is reinforce the findings and ensure that the wider community will accept the hypothesis of the experiment, whatever that may be. So, the violent TV and play experiments are conducted again and again following the exact same procedures, will each time yield the same results. If findings from research are replicated consistently, they are considered reliable. If data can't be replicated, then that suggests there must have been something else affecting the results. And something else to take into consideration in regards to experiments is validity. And that means the credibility or believability of the research. Are the findings genuine? Does the experiment measure what it is intended to measure? Does it meet all the requirements of the research method? For example, was there randomization in the groups? In the TV play experiment, were the participants really chosen at random? Or were most of the kids in one group were kids that grew up together on the same street? Or most of the kids in one group were kids that went to the same school? Or they have some other characteristic that makes them similar that should be factored in. And there's actually two kinds of validity, internal and external, but we're not going to worry about that here. Something else to take into consideration with an experiment is association. And all this means is the relationship between two variables, that the value of one changes with the value of another, the connection between two variables. So, sticking with the example of watching a TV show with violence in it and aggressive play, if an experiment found there was a relationship between the two, they would say that there's an association between those two variables. So overall, when it comes to experiments, they are absolutely very, very valuable from a sociological perspective with topics of sociological relevance. But you can see there's a lot of things to consider if you're thinking of conducting any kind of research experiment. It's not something that's necessarily quick and easy. You need to keep all these factors in mind to ensure that your experiment will be worthwhile and conducted properly.